Scientific evidence proves that Africa is the birthplace of humankind. Known generally as Africans, this primitive race has had a fascinating history. Their culture is also a captivating one. They brought this culture to the U.S. in 1619, when the first African slaves arrived in Virginia. These slaves in the 17th and 18th century were treated poorly. Even on their voyage to the new land, they were treated beyond injustice and inhumanity. The ships were very crowded, and the food and water went rotten within a few weeks. Once there, they worked hard to produce tobacco, rice, and indigo in farms of the southern states. African Americans were then used as a cheaper and more plentiful labor source than the previous workers, who were poor Europeans. Despite the fact that this act was degenerate to the African people, their intents to suppress their unprecedented bondages were always constant. Many men and women rose to leave a mark in history and try to help take their suffering race out of their disconsolate misery. Men and women who helped were Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Marcus Garvey, among many others.
All of the contributions these African men and women made, whether big or small, helped to end slavery. Their dream, that once seemed unattainable, eventually was fulfilled on the summer of 1865, which was the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. Nonetheless, they were still viewed as an uncivilized race. Because of this, the Harlem Renaissance flourished with the purpose of allowing Americans to explore the African American culture, and as a result, the Renaissance left its own mark in history. In 1920, just after World War I, approximately 1.5 million African Americans migrated from the southern states to the north. Due to a rapid growth and fame of the demand for an industrial workforce, city populations grew over 200%, including the thriving cities of Detroit in Michigan and Cleveland in Ohio. However, the largest population rise was in Harlem, New York, with over 200,000 African Americans living in that city alone. Because Americans still viewed colored people as a shameful race and were neglected from society, they all made cities within cities so that the two would eventually interlace.
Harlem now became the epicenter of the Renaissance, and it eventually bared its name. Harlem was a city within another city, created by the Africans who migrated there. It is located in the city of Manhattan, in the southernmost part of New York, and right next to the border of New Jersey. One major influence to the Harlem Renaissance was art. Art can include paintings, poems, and rhymes, among many other types. Some artists include Claude McKay, Aaron Douglas, Jacob Lawrence, and Langston Hughes.
Claude McKay was born on September 15, 1890. He is most famous for his poems and novels. Some poems of his included If We Must Die and Spring in New Hampshire. Some novels that he wrote include Home to Harlem, Banjo, and Banana Bottom. He also wrote an autobiography called A Long Way From Home, which focuses on his personal experiences as a minority, and it calls for a broad movement against racism and segregation. His most famous piece of work is If We Must Die. This is one of the most influential poems of the Harlem Renaissance. Some inspirational lines of this poem are,
If we must die, then let us nobly die, O kingsmen! We must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back.
He left an everlasting mark in history and died on May 22, 1948. Jacob Lawrence was a painter. He was born in Atlantic City, New Jersey, on September 7, 1917. When he was 2 years old, he moved to Easton, Pennsylvania. His parents got divorced when he was 7 years old, and Lawrence and his two younger siblings were deposited into a foster care in Philadelphia. He first became interested in art when he was 13 years old, just after he moved to Harlem to join his mother. He is most famous for creating narrative painting series, which are 30 or more paintings on a single subject. His most well-known series was Migration of the Negro, also known as the Migration series, which he completed in 1941. The series was exhibited at Edith Halpert's Downtown Gallery in 1942, making him the first African American to join the gallery. Another series that he painted was the War series, which he painted, influenced by World War II. He also painted 48 other paintings during World War II, but they cannot be found. Jacob Lawrence died on June 9, 2000.
One very famous poet and artist was Langston Hughes. He was born on February 1st, 1902. He played a large role in influencing African Americans. He encouraged Negroes to keep dreaming because he said,
"If dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly."
He also encouraged Americans and promoted liberty and freedom. As well as an artist, Langston Hughes was also a jazz musician. He casted off the influences of white poets and wrote with the rhythmic meter of blues and jazz. He wrote many plays and poems and novels as well. Some examples of his works are The Weary Blues and The Way of the White Folks. He also proposed some lyrics for the musical titled Street Scene, and they were used. He too made a mark in history and then died on May 22, 1967.
The Harlem Renaissance is also recognized for its African American cultural explosion. Music is well based in the roots of the African culture. That is why music is one of the major ways Africans left their mark in Harlem. Musicians that greatly affected the Harlem Renaissance include Louis Armstrong, Cobell Callaway, Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, and Jelly Roll Morton. Louis Armstrong was born on August 4, 1901. He was one of America's most famous trumpeters, and also one of the many influential musicians of the Harlem Renaissance. Not only was he a trumpeter, but he was also a band leader, singer, soloist, film star, and a comedian. After being sent to boys' home, Armstrong learned to play the cornet and realized that he loved to play it. Later, after playing for a band in New Orleans, his hometown, he moved to Chicago where he played for several bands. He finally reached New York where he began to perform and record like nowhere else. On April 5, 1923, he recorded his own solo called Chimes Blues. He made the biggest impact of jazz music. Here, he died on July 6, 1971.
Cobell Callaway, mostly known as Cab Callaway, was born on December 25, 1907. He also had a great impact on New York, even though he grew up in Chicago. He first began to perform and learn the art of scat singing in Chicago. Scat singing was a popular form of singing in which the singer's voice imitates an instrument. Louis Armstrong taught him when he was in Chicago. Cab Callaway slowly changed the way that African Americans were seen by the public. He would usually perform at the Cotton Club during the 1930s. After the success of his most famous song, Minnie the Moocher, in 1931, he became one of the greatest entertainers of the 1930s and 1940s. He died on November 18, 1994.
Bessie Smith was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee on April 15, 1894. She became the most popular blues singer of her time and impacted Harlem with the blues. One of her first tracks ever recorded was titled Downhearted Blues, which sold over approximately 800,000 copies. She also worked with other famous musicians, including Louis Armstrong. However, due to the Great Depression, her career floundered, and she was less popular due to the lack of recording. Sadly, she died at a young age of 43 when she got into a car crash on September 26, 1937. Billie Holiday, another female singer, helped popularize jazz music during the Harlem Renaissance. From an early age, she had not led a good life. However, what makes her most famous and recognized is her courage and luck to make a career from her singing after going through all her troubles and mistreatment. She eventually died on July 17, 1959, from substance abuse, but was later inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2000. Both Bessie Smith and Billie Holiday were famous for making the blues and jazz music popular.
Although he is not as famous as these previous musicians and artists, James Weldon Johnson wrote a poem which would later become known as the Black National Anthem. In 1899, he wrote this poem, and later that same year, his brother, named John Rosamond Johnson, turned it into a song. In it, Johnson interprets liberty and how the African Americans are traveling through a rough road. Later in the end, they ask God to keep them in a good path.
The Harlem Renaissance would not have existed without all of these people, who motivated every single African American to stand up for their rights. Many of them also brought both whites and blacks together with their performances, songs, and plays. Without them, the African American people would have probably continued to be mistreated and neglected by many people. Whether it was through paintings or poetry, everyone was influenced to stay strong and to never give up, and they all followed their dreams of a life full of liberty and freedom.